I want to acknowledge that we are joined by Council Vice President Chuck Ty, Councilmember Chowdhury, and Councilmember Cashmans as guests, and who will be speaking on the next item, which is considering a passage of a resolution establishing a Minneapolis Labor Standards Board, as well as returning the subject matter of an ordinance establishing that board to its author. I will first call on Clerk Carl, who will give an overview of a few things before we dive deeper into this issue.
Good afternoon, committee members. Mr. Chair, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk for the city of Minneapolis. As you noted, I'm here today before you in connection with a proposal to create a Minneapolis Labor Standards Board. As part of the enterprise-wide reforms to our city's appointed boards and commissions, any proposal to establish a new appointed body must first be reviewed by the city clerk, and a report on that proposal issued by the clerk which analyzes the need for the new body, any possible duplication or conflict with existing appointed bodies, and the anticipated impact of that new body in terms of city resources and operations. That requirement is set forth in Section 10.40B of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances, and accordingly, as required by that code, I'm presenting my review of this proposal for the committee's consideration. A full copy of my report was submitted and is included in the LIMS file, which is accessible to the public via the city's website. For the sake of time, I'll simply summarize my findings on the proposal. First, on its face, this proposal appears to duplicate or to at least share many points in common with the existing Workplace Advisory Committee. The Workplace Advisory Committee was created in 2016. It was a first-of-its-kind body that was specifically created to bring together employers and business interests with employees and worker advocacy groups to discuss and make recommendations on workplace policies and regulations in Minneapolis. It was created during and alongside some groundbreaking work in the city to adopt local policies on earned, sick, and safe time, minimum wage, wage theft protections, and small business labor compliance assistance, among others. Minneapolis has a long and a proud history of labor rights activism, and the creation of the Workplace Advisory Committee is a part of that history. Second, both the Workplace Advisory Committee and the proposed Labor Standards Board are intended to support and to advance the city's commitments to strengthening and protecting workers. The proposed Labor Standards Board is intended to support a strong and resilient local economy, an economy which also, as we know, fuels the state of Minnesota. It's intended to provide a shared space where employers and employees alike can collaborate on issues related to workplace regulations and issues of equity, health, and safety. And while there are many similarities between the Workplace Advisory Committee and the Labor Standards Board, there are some innovative approaches to the proposal for a Labor Standards Board that I think distinguish it from the existing Workplace Advisory Committee. Perhaps the biggest improvement that the Labor Standards Board presents is the use of industry-specific working groups, which are defined within the resolution as sectoral work groups that would be composed of representatives within the industry to reflect employers, employees, and community stakeholders. These sectoral work groups would be tasked with examining workplace issues within specific sectors and making targeted policy recommendations to the full Labor Standards Board. Another innovation is the use of a unique tripartite voting system in those sectoral work groups, which is intended to force collaboration and compromise. It does that by requiring that any recommendation from the sectoral work group must have the support of at least one representative from each of its major participating groups. That means at least one representative from the employer group, one representative of employees, and one representative from community stakeholders must agree in order to achieve a formal recommendation to submit to the Labor Standards Board. Absent that required tripartite majority vote, no action, no recommendation could be submitted. Again, that is a deliberate design choice to require compromise between the interested groups when evaluating and making recommendations about any potential workplace policies and regulations. Finally, I'll point out that the draft resolution gives the Labor Standards Board some added duties that are not currently provided for the Workplace Advisory Committee. Those additional duties have to do with training on city workplace policies and regulations. Specifically, the Labor Standards Board would have the ability to develop a recommended curriculum for training employees about their rights under applicable local, state, and federal workplace regulations. It would help to educate employees about how to address alleged workplace policy violations and also identify resources available to them to aid them in that process. It would develop and maintain a list of certified worker organizations qualified to deliver training about workplace rights, regulations, and protections, and it would help to coordinate training between employers and certified worker organizations. These duties are clearly an expansion in scope beyond what was envisioned for the Workplace Advisory Committee. From an operating perspective, I think it's important to point out no funding or other resources have yet been identified to support the Labor Standards Board. The resolution calls for the Civil Rights Department to be the department with primary responsibility for supporting this board's work. However, no specific provisions are identified within the draft resolution to actually support that work. As Council has heard me say many times, the work of our city's appointed boards and commissions is not adequately resourced in most instances. Any resource requirements must be approved within the operating budget for the supporting department. And again, in this case, that would be the Civil Rights Department. Given the expanded scope of duties that are envisioned for this board, especially given the structure of any number of subordinate sectoral work groups, I would think it's important that Council address the resource needs of this body from the beginning. At a minimum, the conduct of meetings has budget implications, including, but not limited to, the production of meeting agendas and documentation, the generation of reports and findings, the preparation of formal recommendations, and more. I think it's highly probable that the level of staffing and resource support required for a Labor Standards Board would eclipse what is currently provided by the Civil Rights Department for the Workplace Advisory Committee. Other incidental costs, such as parking as an example, or reimbursements and validations, and similar types of expenses that are usual and customary for appointed boards and commissions also should be considered. I note that, if adopted, the resolution provides for an effective date of May 1st, 2025, so next year. Therefore, I believe there is sufficient time for the Civil Rights Department to provide an estimate of what the resources might be necessary to ensure the success of setting up this new body, and those matters that could be incorporated into the Council's budgetary deliberations for the next fiscal year. Finally, as with all Tier 3 bodies, the proposed Labor Standards Board would have only those powers, duties, and responsibilities that are expressly given to it in its enabling resolution, or which are necessarily implied to carry out those express powers, duties, and responsibilities. As an advisory body, the Labor Standards Board would have no final power or authority, but only the power to submit recommendations on workplace policies and regulations to the City Council for its consideration and possible action as the city's legislative body. Those final legislative authorities to act and enforce local policies on workplace regulations remain vested in the City Council. Specific issues related to a planned transition that would include sunsetting the Workplace Advisory Committee and launching the new Labor Standards Board, addressing enterprise-wide resourcing needs, and similar matters that have been identified at a high level in my report would all need to be addressed during the next several months if the resolution is adopted. That would include collaboration between the Clerk's Office and the Civil Rights Department to coordinate a successful recruitment process for board members, working in partnership with the mayor and council to do those appointments. I believe that one of the most important keys to the success of this initiative will be the recruitment and appointment of individuals to the Labor Standards Board who share a strong commitment to the stated goals of the new body. And that will require active participation from all council members and the mayor. That summarizes my review of the proposal for a Labor Standards Board. Mr. Chair, as I said, the full report is attached in the LIMS file and available for your reference and for the public. I know a comprehensive presentation has been planned, so I'll make myself available for any questions or concerns when that presentation is complete.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And before I turn it on to Council Vice President Chuck Tai, I might need your assistance, Clerk Carl, or help from the City Attorney's Office, but we have an amended version before us that we would like to move, and that the authors are going to be speaking on the presentation. So I'm trying to figure out the best order of operations in this instance. I feel like it's smart to move forward with the amended version, allow the authors to speak on the amended version for the public to understand what is in this version that is updated, and then have discussion and then move forward.
Mr. Chair, I think that's an excellent proposal. The matter is still in draft form. The amendments that are shown in red line on the copies that are at your desk are also available here for the public. I know there's a limited number, and will be put online by the clerks and LIMS in the LIMS file. So what's before you is the original resolution. There's an amendment. Whatever is moved by the body would be what you would consider. I would also note that this is a unique situation in that, and I'm sure the authors will speak to this, the original proposal was to amend our Code of Ordinances in the form of an ordinance. So one of the actions that the body will need to take or consider is to act on the draft resolution in the amended form and as further amended by this body, possibly, and also to return to author the ordinance. Since this is a Tier 3, the action would be by resolution and not by ordinance. And then I would suggest, not ask, but it was in my report, an item you may consider recommending for the full council, which is not listed on the agenda, but I think would be appropriate, is requesting a report back from the Civil Rights Department in time for any consideration on resource implications that I identified at a high level.
Cool. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So I'll move approval of the amended version, and I'll first pass it on to Council Vice President Chuck Tai.
And I'll second that.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Chair Chavez, Vice Chair Wansley, and members of the Public Health and Safety Committee, thank you for welcoming me to your committee meeting today to present the Labor Standards Board resolution to you for your consideration. My name is Aisha Chuktai, and I have the privilege of representing Ward 10 residents on the Minneapolis City Council, as well as serving as the Vice President of our City Council. I'm joined today by Council members Chowdhury and Cashman, who are co-authors of this resolution and have been incredible partners in crafting this policy over the course of this term. Next slide, please.
I don't think, there we go.
All right. In this presentation, I will outline the core components of the proposed Labor Standards Board legislation, which again is authored by me, Councilmember Chowdhury, and Councilmember Cashman. Next slide, please. I'll start with a brief history of this work. In October 2015, the City Council and Mayor established the Workplace Partnership Group to study the impact of policy proposals related to workplace regulations on earned sick time and paid time off. In March 2016, they presented their findings to the City Council, paving the way for the city's Sick and Safe Time Ordinance, which was approved in May of 2016. At the time, elected leaders of the city realized the need for a more permanent advisory board to advise the city on matters related to labor and workplace policy. So as a result, in August of 2016, the City Council established the Workplace Advisory Committee. When the Workplace Advisory Committee, or WAC, was formed, the economy of Minneapolis was dramatically different from what it is today. Policies that helped establish the need for the WAC in the first place and the initial recommendations out of the WAC transformed workers' lives for the better. While the Workplace Advisory Committee has been a critical advisor to the city on workplace policy, as our economy has changed in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the need to craft policy solutions at the sector-specific level and moving away from one-size-fits-all policymaking has become apparent. Next slide, please. In December 2023, Councilmember Rainville's ordinance to establish licensing, business regulations, worker training requirements, and safety protections for the window cleaning sector was approved unanimously by the City Council. Earlier this spring, we enacted legislation to establish a minimum wage equivalent for the rideshare sector, which subsequently resulted in comprehensive statewide regulations for this sector. These two examples highlight how workplace policymaking at the city is happening at the sector level. Without an advisory board of subject matter experts at the table to help craft solutions, the council as a legislative body has been trying to fill that sector-specific gap. There is no formal process for that, so it varies author to author and policy to policy. We need the expertise of people on the ground, employers, workers, policy and regulatory experts, and impacted community members to inform policymaking on an ongoing basis. Just like the Workplace Advisory Committee was the next iteration of the Workplace Partnership Group, the Labor Standards Board is the next iteration of the Workplace Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. A Labor Standards Board gives workers, employers, and community members an equal voice in recommending workplace standards and regulations. Additionally, the Minneapolis Labor Standards Board will also have the ability to study specific sectors by creating what are called sectoral work groups to bring workers, employers, and community partners together to explore specific solutions to the unique challenges affecting a given sector. This allows for the board, the Labor Standards Board, to recommend policy solutions to the City Council that are not one size fits all. As a result, these recommendations provide a data-informed approach for the City Council to develop workplace regulations for specific industries. And finally, based on the Council-adopted Appointed Boards and Commissions Reform Ordinance, this board is a Tier 3 body. As such, it is created by resolution instead of ordinance, so a public hearing on the creation is not conducted. Additionally, our Code of Ordinances defines business size as micro, small, and large. So this resolution also uses that language instead of the mid to large employers language that is in the current Workplace Advisory Committee legislation. Next slide, please. I want to outline the extensive community engagement that has informed this policy. On June 15th, 2022, nearly a year and a half ago, I stood on the steps of City Hall with nearly every member of the City Council, the mayor, and a coalition of community leaders and labor unions to highlight the benefits of a local labor standards board. Since then, the Council has received countless phone calls, emails, and postcards from our residents in support of this policy. We've had advocacy organizations and frontline workers hold rallies, press conferences, and constituent meetings in support of this policy. This spring, I held a community listening session with Councilmember Chowdhury and Councilmember Cashman at the Public Service Building that was attended by several council members and hundreds of residents urging the City Council to establish a labor standards board. In addition to that, Councilmember Chowdhury, Councilmember Cashman, and I have engaged the business community advocates, including folks like the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and the Downtown Council, as well as local entrepreneurs, including small BIPOC restaurateurs. Within the city enterprise, we've also engaged with the Mayor's Office, the Civil Rights Department, which oversees labor standards enforcement work, and the Clerk's Office, which oversees all of the city's appointed boards and commissions, and the City Attorney's Office to ensure this board meets all legal requirements. To put a finer point on this topic, this policy has been extensively developed and vetted alongside stakeholders within the city enterprise and within our broader community. Next slide, perfect. Informed by community engagement, building off the work of the Workplace Advisory Committee, and looking to meet an existing need for a board that better represents Minneapolis and informs the council with policy recommendations, as well as consulting with our city staff. This is the proposed structure of the board. The makeup of this board has three parts. You'll often hear me refer to this as a tripartite structure. It is made up of employee representatives, employer representatives, and impartial community stakeholder representatives. Community stakeholders can be economic policy experts, regulatory experts, consumer advocacy representatives, or nonprofit organizations. As I shared with the committee via email earlier today, after ongoing consultation with the Civil Rights Department, we've added a change to ensure that no member of the Labor Standards Board or subsequent sectoral work groups can be under investigation by the city for possible labor standards violations or have unresolved requirements related to violating the city's labor standards. This ensures continued trust in the Civil Rights Department's investigations. The composition of sectoral work groups reflects that same tripartite structure on a smaller scale. At maximum, only 2 sectors per year can be studied, allowing for thorough and focused exploration of a sector to develop policy solutions to then be forwarded to the Labor Standards Board for a final decision, and then subsequently to the council for its consideration. This structure is built intentionally to form consensus. When a sectoral work group is crafting policy recommendations to send to the council, at least one employer representative, one worker representative, and one community stakeholder representative must make up the majority vote in favor. As I've outlined throughout this presentation so far, the goal of this structure is to foster collaboration among stakeholders, creative solutions instead of one-size-fits-all policy making, It's supposed to increase participation and engagement of those affected day to day by our workplace policies, and ultimately to allow for data-informed policy recommendations to be considered by the City Council. This slide outlines how policy recommendations are achieved by the Labor Standards Board. I'm going to cover this by providing a specific, and I'm going to reiterate this several times, hypothetical example. The Labor Standards Board meets, and by a majority vote triggered either by an appointed member or via consideration of a worker petition, let's say a sectoral work group is created to study the child care sector. This sectoral work group, like all work groups, is focused on a very specific task. One, to use existing information, data, and research to understand the child care sector from the perspective of different employees and employers. Second, it's to solicit information directly from Minneapolis residents, employees, and employers through input, surveys, listening sessions, and direct engagement. Third, after thoroughly studying the sector and talking directly with impacted Minneapolitans, in this case, that could mean parents, childcare facility owners, childcare workers, youth, the sectoral work group would then make policy recommendations. This could include ways to better recruit and retain employees, ways to engage employees, parents, and community members, needed government support and investment or education for employers, and better conditions, wages, or education on rights of employees. And then finally, these recommendations specifically must examine the need to train and educate employers and employees. Regulations are only effective if we're willing to inform, educate, and enforce. That means we need to consider how to support employers in implementing potential changes, as well as ensuring employees understand how new policies affect their workplace conditions. Sectoral work groups have up to 6 months to complete their work. This timeline fosters collaboration, consensus building, and solution seeking. After all, the Workplace Partnership Group studied Earned Sick and Safe Time and presented their findings to the Council within 5 months of their creation. With the support of a majority of the sectoral work group members, again consisting of at least one employer representative, at least one employee representative, and at least one community stakeholder representative, the sectoral work group either recommends a potential policy change or changes, concludes that consensus could not be reached, or concludes that no new potential regulations are needed at the time. This recommendation then goes to the Labor Standards Board, so from the bottom section to the middle section. The Labor Standards Board considers the sectoral work group recommendations on childcare, in this case, in this hypothetical case, and either determines that more work is needed by the sectoral work group before sending those recommendations to the Council, or they vote to recommend the policy changes to the Council, or they determine that they're not going to be making a recommendation on policy changes to the Council. The Council then, based on the outcome here, the Council then receives those recommendations via a report, which includes information on the needs that are being addressed, policy proposals for how to address them, and how to successfully inform and implement and educate in a way that benefits all the stakeholders in childcare: employers, employees, experts, parents, and the broader community. The Council can then begin the work through the standard legislative process to create these policy changes. They can ask the Labor Standards Board to do additional work, or they can simply receive and file the recommendations and not further explore new regulations. Finally, I'll end with talking about next steps in implementation. So the implementation date for the board is May 1st, 2025. The Director of Civil Rights has made pretty clear that without additional resources, the department will not be able to appropriately staff this board. A later implementation date gives time for the authors to bring forward a budget amendment to the department for an additional FTE to adequately support the board through our annual markup process. It also gives time for our staff in the new year to go through the HR process, to hire and onboard a staff member and prepare them for the role, all before the work of the Labor Standards Board formally begins. It gives needed time to ensure a successful sunsetting of the Workplace Advisory Committee and the establishment of the Labor Standards Board without disrupting existing work. As authors, we spoke directly with staff and members of the Workplace Advisory Committee about the delay in implementation date. Both expressed support for it, and we are confident that moving forward in a thoughtful and deliberative manner before the work gets started is critical to the board's success. And then I want to thank you for your time and consideration, Mr. Chair, and I ask for your support of this amended resolution so that Minneapolis is better engaging our residents, receiving recommendations suited to our current economy and business and workforce, and adopting data-informed policies that support our local economy. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to respond to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Council Vice President Chugtai and colleagues. Before I even allow Council Members Cashman and Chowdhury to speak, some of my colleagues might have questions here, and they may be directed to all of y'all, so I'll just ask y'all to step up for questions and maybe comments from our colleagues, and then after that, it would be great if y'all can have some closing remarks. Councilmember Rainville.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering if one of the authors could offer an answer to the question why no public hearing like we did with HERC or other advocacy groups. Why not small business owners, allow them to speak?
Thank you, Councilman Rainville. If the clerk can please come up here. We had a public hearing for the ABC ordinance, as you know, for specific tiers. But if you can speak about the ordinance as it is written and why there is no public hearing required for this, that would be helpful.
Mr. Chair, to all the council members, I will point out that the difference between an ordinance and a resolution is an ordinance is a local law. It's the equivalent of a municipal statute. And so under our process and rules, public hearings are required before final action on an ordinance. A resolution is an administrative act that expresses either a policy position or authorizes certain action be taken within the local government's authority. And so in this case, the council is acting by resolution, which is its home rule authority, to create a subordinate body as a Tier 3 advisory body to give it advice, feedback, and recommendations within a defined or subject matter delegated to it through the resolution. In that instance, because of both the instrument used, a resolution, as an administrative act to create a subordinate body that operates under the direct oversight of the council, there isn't a need for a public hearing. So that's why there is no public hearing associated with this proposal. I will remind everyone that when we did, per the chair's request, take up the ordinance, the local law on the creation of boards and commissions, there was a public hearing, because that is a local law that prescribes how this body will enact either by ordinance or resolution and create subordinate bodies. So I think I've answered your question, Mr. Chair. If I haven't, I'm happy to respond to further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Councilmember Rainville, do you have follow-ups?
That really doesn't answer my question. Maybe I should direct this rather not to an author but to the chair. You know, we had a public hearing for the HERC. We just had an advocacy group in here stop one of our council meetings, and they were allowed to speak, and now they're going to be allowed to speak at a committee of the whole. So why not let the small business community speak? Maybe that's a question for the chair to answer. Mr.
Rainville, I think that's a perfect question. If you're asking this as the chair of the committee, we have almost 100 advisory boards and commissions in the city of Minneapolis. If we want to entertain a public hearing for every single ABC, which is about 80 of them in the city of Minneapolis, that would be a conversation that we would need to have, of having this for every single advisory board in the city of Minneapolis, for Tier 3s specifically, I guess. So I think if we're going to do it for this, I'm more than happy to talk about what it looks like for doing it for every single Tier 3 body in the city of Minneapolis as they go through different committees. Now, in regards to the committee of the whole, we did not allow for public comment period at full council for the tragic shooting of Mr. Maturi. We said that we are going to allow a public comment period in committee of the whole, which was not at full council. It's a completely different committee that we decided to do that on, because we also know that Public Health and Safety Committee is running long until the very end of the year. We have a calendar that we're trying to manage that is very difficult to even get across the finish line for the end of the year. So we know that we don't have much time in the committees that were even set forward. We know that the last committee of Public Health and Safety is already going to run very long until the very, very end. So this is also about timing. So I hope that answers your question. But if the authors would like to answer, maybe that would be helpful too. But since you directed that question to me, that's also part of my answer too. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Rainville. I'll just say this. It was something that we highly considered, as this is the first board that will be in formation since the ABC reform, right? So it's going to set the tone of how we do proceedings when it comes to new boards and commissions. We just passed the ABC reform. And so it felt important to us, since we were doing a resolution, and we were on the trajectory of doing an ordinance. That's why we noticed it, and we were prepared for a public hearing. But since this is through resolution, through the ABC reforms that were done, we wanted to make sure that we set the tone correctly for the consistency of the policy that's placed. I think we act as a body, and so this body has the ability, every council member has the ability to make changes. Maybe that's a change that needs to be considered to the ABC ordinance itself, if that's something that this body wants to take up. And also, I'm not a member of this committee, but we all have tools to make motions around public hearings and public comments. And so definitely, if that's a tool that's available to you. And then I'll just say, we have been highly engaged with community members, small business stakeholders, and that's why we made sure that we were available to have those discussions. And while we might not have a public hearing today, people can still make public comment. So I encourage you, if you want to make your voice heard on this issue, council comment at minneapolismn.gov. That is submitted to all of us before we take our final votes. Your voices matter. We're not encouraging a public, or we're not saying we're not doing a public hearing because we don't want to hear from you. We're wanting to be consistent with this policy. You can feel free to call me as a council member of the 12th Ward or other council members, and we'll listen to you and have that inform our discussions as we come to the final vote.
Thank you. What do you, any of the other? Okay, great. So I just, for the record, I want to document what I've heard from the small business community in the 3rd Ward and across the city. That, in essence, what this is going to do is pit small business owners against their employees. Employees who already have protections under federal, state, and city laws. This makes the city government become a union organizer. This will do nothing to increase the amount of empty, to decrease the amount of empty storefronts in uptown or downtown. The business community has made it clear that when their leases are up, they're going to leave Minneapolis or just simply close their business. We also heard from the clerks that this is going to create more government, which means more cost. There's going to be a large cost associated with this. And in essence, it's going to create another situation where we had with the Uber and Lyft ordinance, where the state government stepped in and preempted our city's authority. So I would hope that I see all the women-owned business owners here. I see the BIPOC owners here, the people that we all try to help under our equity plan. But please keep trying. Don't give up because you're not allowed to speak today. And encourage my fellow colleagues to be more transparent in how they interact with you, and in essence, place demands on your businesses that they're trying to tip the scales in these employer-employee relations. Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Mr. Chair, first, we need to go back for a minute. We have 47 boards and commissions. I think the number you were thinking of is how many hundreds of volunteers we have that serve on those commissions.
I said around, but yes, proceed.
This body could, by majority vote, give community a voice in this process before we vote on this, and I'd like to try. And let's read the room here, literally, if we need to. I'd first like to note that communications around this resolution have been non-existent. I've been getting asked this all summer by many local business owners, and it was always, I don't know where this is in the process. So this topic wasn't even on the draft agenda for this meeting. I only learned this was coming forward after agenda setting and then on the published agenda. I would have requested a briefing from the authors had any communication timeline been shared on this. It happens with other ordinances. I requested a public comment session before we take up this resolution. Authors responded this afternoon. I see a clear need for public comment, a chance for the public to share their thoughts, and we have done this in the past before we've taken action. Some examples are HERC, as Councilmember Rainville offered, but also the Climate Legacy Initiative, improving workforce culture, the police contract, municipal child care. I'd like us to use that same process here. So I will make a motion to postpone this item one cycle and add a public comment session with appropriate notice to our next PHS committee meeting that would be, I think, on November 20th. That still gives us time to complete the legislative process this year, but there is value from hearing from the public and local business owners on this. I mean, it's clear there's still a lot to work through. And I think this is controversial. It was when it came up before and then sort of went silent. With any controversial issue, let's make sure we're following an open and transparent process. And so I'd make that motion. I would need a second on it.
Second.
There is a motion and there is a second, and I'm going to ask the public to please be respectful. I keep hearing things in the back room of potentially authors in the room, so please be respectful. Also, there is a second to Councilmember Palmisano's motion to postpone and potentially add a public hearing. If we can get the queue up for discussion on Councilmember Palmisano's motion.
And if I may, Chair, I have no problems with the other amendments. That I see that as an improvement, the small number of changes that were sent today through email. So I don't know how this stacks with those amendments. But right now, I would just like to say we're going to take a minute and hear from the public on this. Not today, in an appropriate, noticed way. And I'd like a vote on that.
Yep, for sure. So if we can get folks on queue, or we'll use a tag because I think it's not popping up. If folks want to speak on Councilmember Palmisano's motion, Councilmember Ellison, I know you're on queue, but you're on queue for Labor Standards Board. I'm not sure if you're on queue for this. Otherwise, I can speak too. But okay, Councilmember Cashman.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I just wanted to speak quickly to the HERC situation because I did author that resolution that came through the Climate and Infrastructure Committee, and that was an issue that we were taking a position on as a city about a trash incinerator downtown, and so it felt really important to hear the different community advocates' positions on that as we crafted a resolution stating our position on a trash incinerator. But in this case, this is a resolution to create an appointed board and commission at the city for which, as the other authors have said, is following an ordinance that we just passed as a body about how to create a new appointed board and commission at the city. So, and we're talking about transparency right now, and I think with the authors, we have done 4 or 5 listening sessions just this year with workers' organizations, with business organizations, and done a lot of community engagement on that. And it's not to say that I'm opposed to doing a public comment period, but I think that engagement has happened and that we've heard a lot of voices and that we have received a lot of feedback and that feedback has been incorporated into this draft. So that's, there was a listening session that we held at the Public Service Building. There was a listening session at Lurkat, a restaurant in my ward, and all council members were welcome to attend those instances as well to hear from the various stakeholders. And as authors, obviously, it makes sense for us to have been there and to do all this community engagement. But that's why I think that, we're following the policy that we set as a council about how to establish a board and commission, and we should follow that.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I won't be supporting this motion in light of we just literally dealt with the situation last week as was mentioned, we had community members who showed up for full council asking for a public comment period at that same time. And in consultation with the clerks, we learned that doing a moment's notice of a public comment could potentially put us in violation of open meeting laws, and to basically give everyone the ability to show up for public comments in advance. I think there is absolutely an opportunity if Council Member Palmisano would like to, as what I'm having to do right now, submit a public comment maybe for full council. But I don't see the need to delay this item an additional cycle. I think if there is interest amongst those who want to do a public comment, that can be integrated into committee meetings that we will have up until full council. And I know I'm literally having to go through that process now for a different matter that was referenced, so I at least wanted to note that. And we're having to do that public comment at Capitol.
Council Vice President Chuck Tai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just talk really briefly about the appointed boards and commissions reform ordinance. That was something that was approved last term, and it really was was driven largely by our staff, who wanted to make some structural changes to how appointed boards and commissions exist in our city to be able to better manage them. But I know it also included a lot of partnership and collaboration with members of the council. Several members of the Public Health and Safety Committee here were authors of the appointed boards and commissions reform ordinance. And if at that time you determined, alongside the clerks, that there wasn't a need for a public hearing, public comment period on Tier 3 appointed boards and commissions, and now you've decided that you don't believe that anymore, and perhaps you want one for every single one, I would actually encourage that the more appropriate way of going about doing this is to amend the appointed boards and commissions reform ordinance through the standard legislative process. And that at this time, with the adopted policy that we have at our city for creating appointed boards and commissions, a public hearing or a public comment period is not appropriate for this tier of body. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Ellison.
I can't add too much. There are a lot of reasons, a lot of extenuating circumstances for why we would choose to delay. It can be, usually it's kind of aldermanic privilege if something's happening in your ward or something that you want to take up and you want some more time to work on it. Those are all appropriate reasons for delay. And I just don't see that exists here, right? I think that, I don't know. I feel like I've been properly engaged with. I do feel like the authors have done a lot of engagement, and I would support, kind of to Councilmember Chavez's point, if we wanted to re-examine when we do public hearings in general. We just made changes, for example, to the Housing Advisory Board, and we went to the board and talked directly about those changes, and then we just sort of passed them in council on consent, and so they're, So we didn't have a process for them to come and do a public hearing and make and give their opinion, but we did provide platforms for those changes to occur. And so, if there had been, to my mind, like not enough public meetings, or if there were, then I would be a little bit more open to seeing this circumstance as unique. But I don't see the circumstances for delay as unique as we sometimes see when we have council members dealing with difficult dynamics around a liquor store or a tobacco shop, or difficult dynamics, in their ward. I don't see where that need exists here. And so I won't support this delay today, but I'm happy to talk about how we want to engage and be uniform in how we talk and how we make these kinds of changes to our boards.
Seeing no further discussion on Councilmember Palmisano's motion to delay this cycle and add a public comment period, Clerk, if you can call the roll on that, please.
Councilmember Payne.
Nay.
Rainville.
Aye.
Ellison.
No.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Nay.
Chair Chavez.
No.
We have 2 ayes and 4 nays.
And that motion does not carry. So we're back to the original motion, which is moving the amended version with the changes forward for approval, and I have myself next on queue. I just want to talk about why I'm supporting this resolution, and I kind of want to level set a little bit. This is an advisory board. I'm sorry, but the sky is not falling. We're in a moment in our country where we have immigrants in our city and in our state and in our country who feel unsafe. In a time in our country where they feel demonized, unsupported, and left behind. And what a labor standards board does in this moment, it's even more in this moment after yesterday's appalling news that we heard that many of our community members who are struggling to get by are going to be struggling for the next 4 years. And what a labor standards board is pretty simple. It's going to allow those community members to have a voice at the table. A voice at the table to be able to at least have a fighting chance in Minneapolis to have better workplace protections. You know, at any moment and any time, my office can submit a notice of intent to add a $15 minimum wage ordinance. I can do that next cycle without talking to business leaders, without talking to unions, without talking to any community partner whatsoever. And I can do that without any input. I think that we should be grateful that a platform is going to exist where business leaders, community partners, unions, our community members and workers are actually going to have an opportunity to weigh in on the implications of any policy. That's what this is. I was reading the resolution, went through the presentation, and I'm still having a hard time understanding what the issue is here. I don't see an issue with an advisory board that's going to give voices to workers, to our community partners, and to business leaders. You know, this is one of the issues that my office has been communicated with from a diverse set of constituencies. There are many things that my residents are very passionate about, but an area that I represent, which is heavily immigrant, this is one of the things that they want and that they are asking for because they do not feel safe in their current workplace environment. Yes, workplaces are lopsided. Folks that are workers are oftentimes treated unfairly by their employers. And those people deserve a seat at the table to make sure that they are being protected. I think this is one of the easiest votes I'm going to take in my time as a city council member in the city of Minneapolis. No questions. Workers matter. They deserve a seat at the table. We need to make sure that they have their voices heard, and I'm proud of the work that Council Vice President Chuktai, Councilmember Chowdhury, Councilmember Cashman have done to get to this point. They have been working on this since the beginning of the year, and they have done their due diligence on community engagement, talking to business leaders, community partners, workers in our city on how to do this the best way, and I'm proud that they found a pathway forward that allows us to take a vote to say that people matter in the city of Minneapolis. And in a moment where many of our immigrant community neighbors are fearing the deportation of their family members, the bare minimum we can do is say, today, you're going to have a seat at the table to address your workplace concerns. So I just want to thank the authors for their dedication to our city. And like I said, we are living in some dark times in this country, and it's about time that workers have a seat at the table. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Councilmember Ellison and then Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to thank the authors for this work. I know that the Workplace Advisory Committee was created a little bit before my time, but I remember being a community member at the time and being engaged with the work. And even though it had a broad name, I think that the scope, from what I remember, the scope was pretty narrow. It was to vet and pass essentially 3 workplace policies. I'm not saying that was the full extent of the work group, but earn sick and safe time, $15 minimum wage, debating the tip credit. These were the things that were really central to the work that was happening there. And then that work concluded, that work wrapped up, and there wasn't I didn't feel a strong identity for the Workplace Advisory Committee to continue, but there's still a strong need for us to have an advisory group that can give us recommendations about what workers need and how workers' lives can be improved by their government. And so what I commend the authors for is taking the spirit of the Workplace Advisory Committee, updating it, giving it a modern face, modern engagement, that we can proceed and and instead of working on 3 policies that move forward and are concluded, we have a more sustainable body that can move forward and give the city council advice on what we need to see in our workforce, period. So, I just wanted to give that context. It's an advisory group. Often, and one of the upsides of an advisory group is that we have all these experts, all these people with lived experience who can tell us what their needs are. The downside of an advisory group is that if there's not an interested council member that's ready to engage, if the culture of that advisory group is not, clearly linked with the council and has a clear relationship with the council, it can kind of wane, it can kind of atrophy. And so I think that this model is set up to not atrophy. It's set up to have longevity, to have legs beyond what any single author, their tenure here at the city. And so that's why I'm supporting this today, and just want to thank the authors for the work that they put in.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
This isn't about pride in our authors. I appreciate your work. I thought maybe we could agree that this is a rather complex and robust new board and commission. This is not necessarily needed for every new board and commission. It's very appropriate here. A lot of my concerns around this are about people calling me leaving those comment sessions that you had that were hosted by the authors, actually. But that's not the will here. So maybe the authors would be open to creating a work group to address what the needs are with a labor standards board and address some of these contentious issues around the board instead. Maybe local business owners could go and talk about it there, and it would be a dialogue instead of just a public comment session where then they're relying on us to then ask questions of city staff. That would be another option. Local business owners are downright fearful, and I've been contacted by literally dozens of Minneapolis business owners. I don't have a work group something ready to bring forward today, but I could do so by the council meeting if there's will here, seeing the path we're obviously on. But my next issue is about cost. Who's paying for this? The fiscal note says that an FTE in the Civil Rights Department will be required and that it will cost $1. That's not a thing. Previously, the Workplace Advisory Council had asked for $800,000 in one-time money, and you're expanding its duties. I'm sure it's a mistake in the fiscal note, but that's what it says. So I'm looking for a number of additional staff here, and it says $1. Another part of this ordinance talks about how the sectoral work groups will solicit information, testimony, input, essentially somebody out doing survey work. How are we paying for that? Cost is one question I would have for the authors. Another is about placement. I understand the connection of this to the Board of Civil Rights for enforcement purposes. I see Director Michelle Phillips and Brian Walsh here in the audience, but it's also heavily involved with economic policy. Would CPED maybe be a better partner here? They have experience. Is the primary focus of the Labor Standards Board to research and develop and recommend policy? If so, for it to succeed, it needs to be supported with economic analysis and policy development, and that expertise it needs to be supported by staff, and that expertise sits more in CPED. Luckily, we already have an economic and policy division. It has incredible expertise, including engagement with small businesses in the workplace. They have existing relationships and could really have those dialogues instead of putting this in an enforcement area. Why would we invest new resources recreating this function all over again elsewhere in the enterprise, especially including civil rights, which has really more enforcement responsibilities, not policy development? So that's my next concern.
Thank you. I know, Councilor Cashman, you're on cue. Council Vice President Chuck Terry is on cue to answer questions. Can you all handle? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to just speak really briefly to the fiscal note question. Yes, certainly that is a typo. I think something that Clerk Carl highlighted actually in his presentation, and something that we've been in pretty close communication with Clerk Carl about is the exact cost associated with an appointed board and commission. Now, he highlighted some of those in his presentation, but what we will note to you is the next step here is actually working with the Civil Rights Department to determine what the exact cost of adding an FTE and some of those administrative costs look like, so that they can come through the standard budget process in these upcoming weeks as we approve the 2025 city budget. So that those are the next steps related to cost. Now, certainly there are functions that exist here in the city that have astronomical costs associated with them, right? And that's not what this is. So I wanted to address those couple of comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Palmisano, do you have a follow-up to that, or are you on cue for comments regarding this
Not
overall?
specific to that topic, so I'll yield to others and then come back.
Thank you. Councilmember Cashman.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I'll just speak a little bit to some of the other questions raised by Councilmember Palmisano. One on work group. A work group would also have a cost, so I think the Labor Standards Board is a work group and has the ability to create work groups. So I think that's the goal here, is actually to solicit work from our community members on the topic of labor policy. And then Council Vice President talked about cost, but just about the expertise from CPED. I absolutely agree that we should engage CPED, and I think the appropriate time to do that would be when the Labor Standards Board passes a recommendation, because that recommendation would then come to the City Council for consideration, at which time we can do whatever we want with it. We could refer it to staff. We could engage our policy and research team further. We could talk to any number of city staff and experts on the policy recommendation that comes from the Labor Standards Board before we decide to take action on it. But I did just want to speak to why I'm co-authoring this policy and why I think it's important. If you're anything like me, you woke up with an absolute pit in your stomach this morning, just devastated and very, very scared for both the people of our country as well as our planetary limitations and the environment and the way that our economy is structured and harming both of those facets of our society. But I definitely want to speak to Minneapolis and what we can do here at the local level. Why we're even in city government is to protect our people. And I think that with the deregulation of industry that we can expect in 2025 at the federal level, it is a perfect time for us to set ourselves up to protect our own workforce and our people here in Minneapolis. That's why I'm really proud to be authoring this resolution to create a board to help us do that. Also, the two most recent labor policies that the City Council has passed were sector specific, and they are perfect examples of what the Labor Standards Board and a sectoral work group could take up. One being the window washers, of which the issue was safety and training, and one being Uber and Lyft drivers, of which the issue was minimum wage. And a Labor Standards Board could create sectoral work groups for sectors like this and have a very robust and transparent and thorough dialogue with a large group of stakeholders on the type of policy that would be most effective in those sectors and make that recommendation to us at City Council. I think that we should all be invested and in favor of community engagement on labor policy, and that's what the Labor Standards Board seeks to create the conditions for. So that's why I'm co-authoring this resolution, and I'm really happy that we're moving it forward at this time.
Council President Payne.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I want to put this discussion into a broader context because I do think that we are very, very zoomed in. One might even say myopic on just the action that's in front of us right now. And I think Councilmember Cashman spoke to this a little bit in her remarks. Vice Chair Wansley spoke to this in her opening remarks. Elon Musk paid $40-some billion to buy Twitter. Peter Thiel got his protege nominated as the vice president. Elon Musk sounds like he might get a cabinet position for the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, so that he can gut the federal government. The Department of Labor has about a $14 billion budget, so we're talking about costs, right? How much is it going to cost to execute some of this programming? The Department of Labor has the Bureau of Labor Statistics, OSHA, the most foundational worker protections that we actually know don't even work that great right now under the Biden administration, right? And they have a $14 billion budget. Elon Musk is talking about cutting trillions out of the budget, although I don't know where he's getting that number from. It seems to pull out of the same place where he gets his self-driving car ideas. And we need to be grounded in the reality of where we're at right now, where workers are at right now, where our struggling businesses are at right now. And I'm not one of the authors of this, but I've taken a lot of meetings and had many conversations with the small business owners that are really concerned about what the future of their business is going to look like in the current marketplace. And those fears are real, and I hear them loud and clear. And the number one thing that they're saying is, I'm afraid that all these regulations are going to happen to my business without me having a voice in the process. And the thing that we're doing today is we're creating a place for your voice to be a part of this process. We're creating a space where, you know, as Chair Chavez said, I mean, right now, the current status quo is a room full of people with red shirts and blue shirts can come in, and whoever has the most shirts or the most voice or the most money can get the most time with the council member and lobby to get their policy prioritized. And we can give notice. That's our legislative process. That's how government works. You can come and you can lobby us, and we can think your ideas are wonderful and run with them. You can donate to our campaigns, and we can still think your ideas are wonderful and run with them. And that's ad hoc. It's not planned. It's, you know, whoever has the most money or the most people wins. What we're doing right now is we're creating a structure so that there's actual equity in this process. So there's an actual process that will lead to better outcomes that has consensus built in structurally. And so I don't want to minimize frankly, we've all been through a mass trauma, not just in the last 24 hours, but in the last 4 years here in our city, certainly. And the world is changed. We need to meet this moment. This is one of the ways that your local government is going to be responsive to meeting this moment, so that workers have a seat at the table, so that small businesses have a seat at a table, so that businesses that run in an equitable and high road way are not competitively disadvantaged for taking care of their employees relative to the other businesses that you're competing against who don't care about their workers. And let me tell you, there are businesses out there that don't care about their workers. They're not the type of businesses that show up in our council chambers really passionately engaged in conversations about policy. They're not in town. They don't care about Minneapolis, let alone the people who work for them, who live in Minneapolis. This is about creating a seat at the table for the people who are invested in our city, who care about building successful businesses, taking care of their employees, taking care of their customers, and doing it in a way that is centered on caring for each other. We're creating the conditions to do that through this. And again, it is an advisory body with no formal authority, but for those of us who are accountable to you, the voters. Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last, I want to talk about balance. The balance of this body in terms of employers and employees, and in terms of who makes these appointments. The composition of this board seems off balance to me. There are seats for 5 employee representatives, which is fine, and then there's another 5 for community stakeholders, which seems to me like it's another name for employee representatives. In order for there to be trust and productive dialogue within the board, as well as within the community and the public, this should not be so heavily weighted to one side. I'm also concerned that the choice of appointments is so heavily weighted to the council. That might suit our goals now, but it might come back to bite us in later iterations of councils and mayors down the line. The composition of the sectoral work groups is not very clear. It appears that 3 of the 12 members will be seated Labor Standards Board members and the others are appointed by the Labor Standards Board. It's not clear how those will be chosen, if they'll apply through the open application process. The language of this resolution says they will be sent to the Minneapolis City Council. Sent for what? Do we get to vote, or is it just like a check the box thing like they're notifying us? What's the process through which this body, which I've heard some of my colleagues generally minimize to people calling concerned about it, oh, this is no different than the Council on Aging. Yes, it is. What's the process by which the Labor Standards Board is going to forward its recommendations to the City Council? Do you anticipate written reports to Council, or what sort of reporting mechanism? That is not outlined here. But let me take the Council President's advice here and zoom out to the bigger picture. First, what have you learned from your conversations with the BIPOC community and the BIPOC business owners through this process? I presume that you've given them time for group meetings and one-on-one meetings, just as I have. I don't see that reflected in your actions here today or in this document. My second question, the bigger, broader picture, is how. How does this Labor Standards Board plan to address workplace inequality and build a stronger economy for all? Please make your comments specific to how this new complex body is going to meet that moment. I woke up with a lot of feelings as well. One of my realizations was, wow, we really have to listen better to one another.
Councilmember Cashman, I see yourself on queue, and then no one else is on queue. So if folks can get on queue, that would be great.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Cashman got into queue for me, and
thank you.
And I'll just say, I mean, Councilmember Palmisano, I'm not sure if you wanted us to answer some of those questions. If you did, I heard many. So if you're able to maybe reiterate some of those, that would be really helpful.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Certainly. First, it's about what did you learn from conversations with business owners as you embarked on this activity? And second, can you help to really zone in and articulate how? How is this Labor Standards Board going to meet the moment? How are we going to build a stronger economy through this particular new board and commission?
Council Vice President Chuktai.
Yeah, I'm happy to address this question, and then I'm certain that perhaps the other authors will have more that they would potentially like to chime in with. So, on what we learned from conversations with small business owners. And so I'll say there have been several iterations of conversations with small business owners in more structured settings, in more informal settings over the course of this last year. And I think the theme that has emerged in common across all of those conversations, at least from my perspective and from the author's perspective, is a deep fear of what could happen, right? So this fear that the city government, but really government more broadly, doesn't have business owners' backs, is not going to do or is not going to consider policies that help them succeed, survive, thrive in our local economy. And then I think a common theme that's very much so tied to that and related to that is that policies or regulations come up in the city and also at other levels of government, and it's like they happen overnight, right? Like a new labor standard or a new regulation comes to exist, and without input from subject matter experts, from people who are going to be directly affected, it suddenly it's suddenly the law. It's suddenly just the thing that has to happen. And then there's no support additionally to understand that new regulation and or materials to be able to help then explain that to their employees. I think that's exactly what this board is meant to address. We should be soliciting input and feedback from those who are directly impacted by a new labor regulation to ask for their perspective. That's what we're trying to do, right? And there's as much leeway given to the board itself to really be driving how they want to be considering these types of regulations, policies, sector-specific solutions. So I think it's this deep concern about not being heard, not being listened to, and not being valued, and that's exactly what we are doing by creating a long-lasting board that meaningfully engages, invites, and takes seriously the feedback from the business community, along with employees, along with people, experts in our community that are impacted by a given sector.
I can jump in a little bit too.
Councilmember Chowdhury.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and then thank you, Councilmember Palmisano. I appreciate your care and the questions that you're asking, and to this ordinance in general, I apologize, resolution, not ordinance, still policy. So I really appreciated the engagement that I was able to have with the small business community, with workers in our city, and with prospective people that might be classified as community stakeholders, whether they're consumers within a sector, whether they're regulatory agencies. I had a great meeting with the Department of Labor and Industry at the state level as a regulatory agency. And one of the things that I heard loud and clear, and Council Vice President alluded to it, is we do not want to see willy-nilly labor standards thrown at us. We have been through a lot as local businesses, specifically the restaurant industry. We have been through a lot. Some of us didn't survive the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're still mourning that. And the future feels uncertain. We don't want one-size-fit-all policies. We don't want this to happen. And when I heard that, I was like, I completely agree with you. We don't want labor standards just popping up out of the air, which is the process that we currently have. And I think that is worth stating again. Any council member currently can do a notice of intent for any labor standard that they like. Should there be someone in the community that is saying this is really, really important, and it would be up to that council member or set of council members to do the work of pulling together stakeholders within a sector, asking them their opinions, and that would be far less robust and far less informed by experts and the people. And I classify experts as people who are impacted by labor standards, and that's the workers, the community stakeholders, and the employers. They would be missing from the conversation, and that's exactly why we felt so strongly about having a tripartite structure and making sure we were giving people a seat at the table. And another thing I'll note is it's really important to say that there isn't unilateral opposition from the business community on this. There isn't. High road employers support this because they are treating their workers well. They are not undercutting their wages. They are not undercutting their benefits. But they look over to the low road employer in that same sector doing that. And I've met the workers who were undercut or had to make a choice between, okay, I'm going to stay within this contract as a custodian to keep my job, or accept lower wages, lower benefits, or I'm going to lose my job because this change was made, right? And those high road employers economically disadvantaged in that system. This is literally just helping us raise the floor for those businesses. So I wanted to make that clear. And you mentioned about action, right? What action did we take out of these conversations that we heard specifically with the local business community? I think a significant step, while it might have just been a few points changed within the resolution that we made, was saying that, hey, once you get to that sectoral level of the work group where the most of the work is going to be done within a specific industry, you need to make sure that you have a simple majority with a vote from one member of each part of that tripartite structure. It doesn't count as a passage to this council, which will then go through another deliberative process, if you don't have an employer, employee, and community stakeholders say, yes, this is a worthy recommendation to forward to the Labor Standards Board at large, and then Labor Standards Board at large would say, forward this to the council. And I think that's significant and worth holding up, because that's about consensus building. That's about checks and balances.
Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Chair. And I wanted to just speak up just because I do echo Councilmember Chowdhury's appreciation for your questions, Councilmember Palmisano. I know what it's like to be a dissenting voice on this council, and it feels like sometimes you can't break through or your concerns aren't taken seriously. And so I want to make sure that we're having this conversation because I think it's an important dialogue. And I just wanted to go back to, just a few examples. I think about some of the assumptions that we can make about what will constitute balance or what will create balance. And I think about the Workplace Advisory Committee, and I remember there was an assumption then that, there's going to be sides. There's going to be, divisions, and people are going to dig in. And I remember our very own former City Attorney Jim Router emerging in that group as somebody who understood the needs of employers, representing Target, but also was somebody who workers on that body felt like they could go to, and disrupted this notion of deep embedded sides. Right? Now, do people still come with their perspective and their expertise? Absolutely. Do people still come with their disagreements? Absolutely. I think about the Workplace Advisory Committee, where there are people on the Workplace Advisory Committee, even though former Councilmember Cam Gordon and myself worked to create that advisory body. There are folks on that committee that I really would struggle to trust their opinion. And then I go to the meetings and I see how people that I do trust, whose opinion I do trust, interacting with people who I'm a little bit skeptical of, and I see that they're working together in ways that would have been unpredictable to me. And so I really see that the structure can't ensure balance, but we appointing people and knowing our community, putting people on that body can work to ensure that balance exists there, right? And I think that's sort of our duty to be there, and certainly dissent and certainly disagreements among each other help us get there. And so I just wanted to both respect the fact that you're thinking about those things, and also maybe provide a little bit of real world examples of where I've seen, both in the former WAC and in the Housing Advisory Committee, just two examples. Not that they encapsulate everything, where I think we've seen examples of that balance maybe falling in places that you couldn't have automatically known looking at the structure or even looking at the makeup of this council. And then to the question of how does this how does this advisory body ensure fair, a fair economy for everyone? I think that, this is one of those questions that kind of demands that people pull out their crystal ball a little bit, right? We can't know exactly what recommendations are going to come out of it. That would almost betray the point of its advisory capacity. And so I really see the opportunity to hear from workers, to hear from employers as the ways, that process, the process of disagreement, the process of engagement, the process of debate and negotiation and compromise, that will produce labor standards, policy, the same way that it did in the WAC, that we can then implement and use to create a better situation for our workers. I'm somebody who's had an opportunity to see some of the substandard conditions that workers that some of our workers are doing in all industries, right? Whether it be construction, whether it be in fast food, and I see that, and so I see the need, but I think it would be a mistake for us to be too prescriptive and say, this is the way that these are the recommendations that this body will produce that will then equal an opportunity that will make the economy work for everybody, right? The process will create the outcome. The structure can't create the balance, but we create that balance. I just think it's really important. I'm glad that you asked the questions, and I just felt like it's really important to kind of give that insight.
Council President Payne.
Thank you, Chair Chavez. I wanted to speak to, I think, Councilmember Palmisano asked a question of how is this going to support our economy? How is this going to kind of solve some of the challenges that we have for our small businesses? And I think that just even the nature of this conversation, it seems like it's very much viewed through the frame of like workers versus small business. And I think what we really need to do, and I'm sorry, I have to deeply apologize for this, our good friend Peter Thiel wrote a book called 0 to 1 with a name that you may have heard of before, Blake Masters. Again, part of a larger project where he advocates for, technology innovation to create monopoly power. We saw the most successful expression of this venture-backed model in Uber and Lyft, where you take the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, launder it through the, venture capital system to subsidize rideshare companies for over a decade until small mom and pop taxi companies don't exist anymore. They just don't exist anymore. So that when we try to advocate for their minimum wage, they're going to pull out of the market and there's not going to be a taxi industry to fill that place. This is not about workers versus small business. This is about small business versus monopoly power. This is about small business versus oligarchy. Elon Musk bought Twitter. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos is now celebrating Trump's victory. Do you think that that's not connected to how we're going to be protecting workers? And do you think it's not connected to how we're going to be protecting a thriving small business community in the city of Minneapolis? This is not about the coffee shop on one corner versus the coffee shop on the other corner, right? This isn't, our favorite neighborhood coffee shops. This is our favorite neighborhood coffee shops versus Starbucks, but Starbucks on crack, because they're going to be completely unregulated and they're going to have the ability. Small businesses cannot compete with these multinational corporations. They just can't. They just can't. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that, A, when these multinational corporations start using their monopoly power to run all of our small businesses into the ground, A, they can't do that by exploiting their workers and getting a competitive advantage, and B, those small businesses, by actually being the good employers that we have in town who actually have deep relationships with their employees and take care of them, they're not getting punished for that. So what we're going to be doing through a consensus process that has all voices at the table is creating a place where competition can thrive rather than monopoly power enabled by the oligarchy drives every single one of our small businesses into the ground, because you can't compete with their access to capital. You can't compete with their ability to pay their workers more than you can afford until you go out of business, and then they cut all those workers' benefits in half, right? Like, these are the things that you're up against. And what we want to do is have an even playing field that doesn't leave workers behind, but is informed by the real practical realities of running your business, and making sure that other stakeholders are involved in that process, and that we're not just, reading a New York Times article about the latest thing that we are concerned about, and then bringing forward policy based on that uninformed or minimally informed approach to policy making. That's what we're doing. We're creating a body so that we can really deliberate those ideas.
Thank you. And next up, we have Councilmember Cashman.
I'm in queue for Councilmember Chowdhury.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Council President, I don't think my election anxiety could continue to this next day. I'll keep it short. I know this committee still has other business to dispense of, and I'll plan on speaking more to it at full council. I think it's important to reiterate here that the process in which a labor standard policy recommendation will come is there has to be 7 votes from the Labor Standards Board to form a sectoral work group. That sectoral work group has a max of 6 months, limited to 2 per year, to do their work and maybe come to consensus on an item. another 7 votes, with 1 from each tripartite, then back to the Labor Standards Board, then they have to vote, and then they have to send it to us as the Minneapolis City Council, and us in a majority have to vote, and then should the mayor agree, he can sign. Should he not agree, he will veto. And if he vetoes, it comes back to us, and we have to have a supermajority to override that. Lots of process, lots of checks and balances. I think fundamentally at the end of this, what this is about is trusting our local businesses, trusting our workers, and trusting consumers and experts, and saying, hey, we trust you. We believe that you're the experts. You should have a table to come together on and have a robust discussion to inform us as policymakers, because we have 15 to 20 different buckets of policy that we have to examine, so many different stakeholders to talk to. So you're providing us a valuable resource, and we trust you to have the conversations together and go through this process so we can make informed decisions and improve workplaces. And we also know that some businesses, most of them, they aren't acting in an egregious way that's impacting their workers in a negative fashion. But we want to go and examine the sectors where workers are struggling, where labor standards that are needed are missing, to improve the workplace and in turn improve our economy and improve our city, completely in line with the values of the city of Minneapolis. And I'll just close with this. I thank the local businesses that have interacted with our offices. It showed me that there's actually an absence of a place for you to not talk about labor standards, but to talk about your needs as a local business, right? Funding, if you're struggling with construction on your corridor, maybe there's technical assistance that you need. Maybe there's barriers at the state level that are making things difficult for you. That feels like a place we need to do more work on. I think the workers that really showed up and made their voices heard for almost 2 years to this council. So those are my comments. I look forward to speaking more to this at full council, and thank you for letting us present today.
All right. So seeing no further discussion on the original motion to approve this item on the new version. I just want to clarify that that's what we're doing here to the clerk's office. And if so, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on approving this item with the new version.
Councilmember Payne.
Aye.
Rainville.
No.
Ellison.
Aye.
Palmisano.
No.
Vice Chair Wansley.
Aye.
Chair Chavez.
Aye.
We have 4 ayes and 2 nays.
And that item is approved, and it is forwarded to the full council meeting.